Chapter 6, Reflexivity. So this is the fourth of the four methodologies that Jackson outlines with his ideal type, with the 2 by 2. And this is in some sense, I would say, the most difficult chapter, so we'll try a short summary. So within the 2 by 2, reflexivity is located at the intersection of monism and transfactualism. The real puzzle and challenge in this chapter is that monism, which itself is already difficult enough to outline and is usually just defined negatively by saying that it rejects the mind-world dualist gap, the gap between researcher and world, that this monism is further complicated by the extension into transfactualism. And the question now is, what does that actually mean for the type of knowledge that reflexivists produce? So the key notion contained in the term reflexivity is the idea that knowledge is reflexive. So in that sense, it's not simply about reflection being a human capacity or ability, but it's about the structure of knowledge, so that in an important way, knowledge influences and precedes its own production. And therefore, duality is a secondary process. What that means is that, for instance, we could have the duality of chicken and egg, so that this by analogy symbolizes the duality between knower and knowledge, so that the duality itself, you could ask what comes first, chicken or egg, what comes first, knowledge or knower, that this duality itself is, in a sense, meaningless and only secondary to the process of knowledge unfolding or life unfolding. So slightly more concretely, we could say that all knowledge is based upon something and can do either of two things. It can reaffirm this foundation or it can challenge it. But in either way, knowledge is always productive. As a consequence, for reflexivists, just like in many ways the same applies to analyticists, there is no meaningful way of talking about a neutral ground. However, reflexivists don't want to simply engage in partisan politics. The aim for a reflexivist is not so much to, so to speak, take sides in the common sense of either or, in the possible either or scenarios that are out there, but rather to transcend the very logic of this either or outside partisan political conflict. And this is then how the statement that knowledge contributes to its own overcoming becomes meaningful. So basically, by turning the tacit and common sense underlying knowledge inside out, reflexivists want to contribute to an overcoming of the knowledge bases from within which they have to formulate their claims somehow. So the idea, the analogy would not be so much a reshuffling of cards. It's not simply about taking sides or about redistributing things within the same game, but it's much rather about changing the very game. So curiously, the notion of prediction becomes meaningful again in reflexivity. However, that's a very different meaning of prediction than the usual understanding that we have from neopositivist science. So if meaningful at all, prediction is always a contribution to the victory of a particular quote-unquote program, as Gramsci would say. So program doesn't mean that we simply contribute to one side of the partisan political debate. It's much rather about transcending and dissolving this very oppositionality. So the program is always a program that wants to dissolve and transcend rather than take sides. And for instance, in Marx's account, the only meaningful way to talk about prediction would be that he predicts a radical transformation of the relations of production. So if we say he predicts in the sense of contributing to the victory of a particular program, he is not simply he's not simply supporting workers' demands for more equal pay or something. He is really predicting and pushing for the victory of a radical transformation of the relations of production themselves. And that's also how the notion of progress becomes meaningful again. So progress is not this commonsensical, very neo-positivistic notion of linear progress, of so to speak an adding up of discoveries into one comprehensive account of all of them, but really progress in the reflexivist sense is very different. It's about radical discontinuity, and it's about transformations. It's really about discontinuous yet somehow contingent jumps and shifts that are so radical that the game itself changes. Also, an important notion is that there's always somehow an affiliation with a marginal group. I'll go deeper into this in one of the other videos, but the idea is that while a reflexivist is always somehow affiliated with or sympathetic towards, or at the very least inspired by a marginal group or the view from that perspective, the aim is not to quote-unquote take sides, but to use that positionality to overcome the foundation upon which it rests. So that is a whole mouthful, but it's really about dissolving and overcoming again. And this is also where this idea knowing is changing becomes meaningful. So as reflexivists, we want to create knowledge that really somehow radically changes the very production of knowledge itself. So knowledge can either be reaffirming not only of things known, but also of a meaningful way to produce knowledge. So good knowledge for a reflexivist is always about changing. It's always about overcoming knowledge itself, our understanding of things, our understanding of the world. So the question of how to go about producing knowledge is then inevitably connected with the question of positionality or rootedness. So somehow there is a problem for reflexivists and somehow monists in general that how can you be rooted in a non-objective positionality and, at least for a reflexivist, progress-oriented and still claim to be scientific somehow? How is this not just some sort of subjectivist BS? So we've already seen an analyticist way out of this dilemma of rootedness, which is actually then not so much a dilemma, but is used as a resource. So for analyticists, your standpoint, your rootedness in society becomes a useful source for insight that allows you to oversimplify things to come up with ideal types that are potentially useful. So your rootedness is a source for creating useful narratives that are, in a sense, useful misinterpretations, because everything's a misinterpretation. That would be, in some sense, the analyticist take on it. However, for reflexivists, it goes a bit further. So there is somehow a judo move. I really like this image of a judo move, because somehow reflexivists at least aim at overthrowing knowledge by utilizing its own force and power. So by being in the field that knowledge already pervades, and therefore being rooted in a positionality where you are necessarily bound up with and dependent on the current way of knowledge and knowledge production, enables you to use that very positionality to overthrow the basis upon which you are in that position. And if you didn't get that, then watch the more detailed video. And finally, how to judge reflexivist scholarship. How do we evaluate the quality? Even though this is never explicitly mentioned in the chapter, I think, I find it useful somehow to distinguish between validity and value. So in one sense, you can talk about a reflexivist account in terms of its internal coherence and validity. And what we would then be talking about is how accurately it captures the underlying understanding, the underlying knowledge, the underlying societal production of knowledge, what counts as good knowledge, what doesn't, and so on. So we could call a reflexivist account valid. However, I would say that its ultimate value will always be measured by how well it does in contributing to overthrowing that basis that it identifies. So validity would be all about how well does this account identify the underlying societal notions of knowledge, good knowledge, and so on. And value would always be about, and how did this contribute to overthrowing what it identified. And I like the notion of diagnosis ex juvantibus here, which is a Latin phrase which basically translates as the diagnosis out of what proves helpful. So what I would at least say is that the ultimate judgment for the value of reflexivist scholarship will always lie in how its diagnosis contributed to overcoming what it diagnosed. So if a piece of reflexivist scholarship contributed to the progress that it aimed for, then we would say that's why its diagnosis was right, that's why it was valuable. So that's it for the short summary, at least. If this raised more questions than it gave answers, don't hesitate to jump to the next video where I hope to go into more detail. However, I do hope that this was helpful nonetheless.